So we'll see how this goes. Well, there's definitely interest in this. This is really good to see. I can see who they are too, but I won't call any of them out. Just silently register that they're people I know, if they're people I know.
How many people have watched the film in advance? Is that a question, David, you would maybe want to ask him?
Yeah, so Jason, who worked with Laurie, had an actual answer to that, and it's a few days old, so I'm sure it's more than this. But as of 2 days ago, 1,200 people had watched the movie on Vimeo. But I bet it's higher now because we've kept promoting it. Oh, here's Tony. Good. 1,200 people, and I see we have over 130 people currently watching us, and I expect that number will climb. But let's give it another minute, and then I think we can dive in. Let's see. Oh, and there is closed captioning for people who want that. You can turn that on. We should say where we all are. I'm in Brooklyn right now. Annie, you're across the street from me in Brooklyn, right?
Yes, Ditmas Park.
Ditmas Park. And where are the rest of you right now, just geographically?
I'm on the west side of Manhattan.
Ralph?
And I'm on the west side of Madison, Wisconsin.
Wow.
I'm in North Haven.
North
The
Haven.
west part of North Haven?
Well, the satellite is facing south. That much I know. So, yeah.
All right. Well, people are going to keep coming in, but I think we can get started. I think we've got plenty of people watching already. So, I'll just say to anyone who's watching that, and I'll probably repeat this, that you are welcome to drop things in the Q&A box, and in our last 10 minutes or so, I think we'll try to get at least a few questions in. But for now, I'm going to start. So welcome to our webinar. I'm David Cleon. I'm the newsletter editor at Jewish Currents. I send all those emails that hopefully you're all getting. If you're not, you should go to our website and subscribe to our emails. They're free, and we don't just send promo stuff, we send a lot of good original content. I think it's good anyway. And I write for other places. And why don't the rest of you introduce yourselves, starting with Laurie?
I'm Laurie Anderson, and I'm an artist in New York City, and I was Lou's partner for, well, let's see, a third of my life. So at that time, 21 years, and that's it.
Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie. I'm the president of the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side. And a few years ago, I was working with Laurie on a project, and we realized that it was May Day, and we wanted to do a public program to go along with it. And I said, what about Red Shirley? And so we were able to gather people then, Tony and Ralph, and others, to talk about Red Shirley. It was one of the most exciting evenings. So I'm excited to be back and able to talk about Shirley a little bit.
Yeah, I should say I'm the latecomer to this. I'm the one who only discovered Red Shirley along with the rest of Jewish Currents in the last 6 months. But we're so excited to get you all back together 5 years later for our audience. Tony.
I teach history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that's where I am right now.
And what kind of history do you teach, Tony?
I teach Jewish history and U.S. history.
All right. And Ralph.
Hi, I'm Ralph Gibson. I'm a photographer and have been for about 60 years, and I'm looking forward to the next 60 years. So.
And Ralph, of course, is the co-creator of Red Shirley, co-director, I guess, of Red Shirley with Lou Reed. So without further ado, welcome to people who are just joining, but let's dive in. Ralph, I wanted to ask you first, how did this film come to be? Especially since I know you have to leave us a bit earlier than everyone else. How did this film come to be? And what is the history of Red Shirley, the film, from you know, to the present, basically. Throw off there.
Interesting. I'll start again. The genesis of this film was very interesting because I met Lou at the home of a mutual friend, Andy O'Hayan, and he was familiar with my work as a photographer, and we started chatting, and he said, "Why don't we get together for lunch?" He says, "Call me anytime." He said, "I'm self-employed, and I can go to lunch when I want to." So we did have a lunch at San Ambrose, and he proposed that I'd be the camera on this film about his cousin Shirley, and I declined because I had been a cameraman in my 20s on a couple of documentaries, and the equipment was just punishingly heavy and uncooperative, and so I really didn't want to do it. And he wasn't very insistent. We had lunch, we had a good time, we talked about music, and then a few weeks later we had another lunch. He eased into the subject again, and it was either the second or third lunch where I told him about the heavy lifting of being a cameraman. And he said, "Well, I have this new camera that I just bought. I treated myself." Later I came to know Lou, and anytime he bought a camera, he said, "I treated myself the other day." So anyway, he took me back to his loft to see the new camera. With a 5D, Canon 5D, and it had remarkable resolution and video capacity. And of the project, and that's how we got started.
And what can you tell us about the experience of working with Shirley and Lou together, and what you saw between them?
Well, the first thing that I noticed immediately was that it was going to be completely improvisational. He had scripted out a few pages of questions and dialogue for her, but as far as the visual component, it was clearly up to me to do anything I wanted. We never discussed it. Occasionally, after a long take, or when we'd take a break for Shirley to give her a rest or something, I should point out we were in her apartment over in Chelsea. Occasionally, we'd look at the little display in the Finder, or we'd look at it on a laptop, and we instantly agreed that that was our look. Our verite approach was going to be what we did. And I was really flying by the seat of my pants, but I was also falling in love with Shirley myself. Completely magnetic, very, very interesting woman. I should point out that I have always, through every phase of my life, sat at the feet of elders, and I'm just attracted to them. I just need to be around somebody older and smarter than myself. And of course, Shirley very quickly assumed that position, even in her weakness, as she was quite advanced. She was in her wheelchair. She didn't have a lot of energy, but her mind was razor sharp. So
that comes through very clearly in the film. I guess just maybe if you could briefly take us over, how the film was released, who saw it, where it was, where it was shown, when it's been available, why it hasn't been more available the last few years.
There's a great story we should add to that. It went to 9 film festivals, and my studio at the time was on Lake Street, where the Tribeca Film Festival was located, and I had been a judge in that festival, and Lou had been a judge many times. And so when we submitted the film to the Tribeca Film Festival, we were sort of looking forward to a favorable response. Didn't seem too outlandish, and they rejected it. They said it was too long a short. It was 28 minutes, and they wanted things that were like 12, 14 minutes long. So it did not make that festival, but as I mentioned, it went to 9 film festivals, and we had a screening at Lincoln Center, which was well attended.
And has it been, where, if at all, has it been available before just recently? I mean, I'll say that we heard about it from just a reader who emailed us in, I think, November, December of last year, said they'd heard of this film. That it had come out in 2010, 3 years before Lou died, and that they hadn't been able to find it anywhere. And they really hoped, maybe we could do something with it. And we eventually, managed to make that happen. And now it's streaming free on Vimeo. But where has it been in the meantime? And when has it been available?
Well, I had a copy on my website, but people don't really know me as a filmmaker because it's I don't think I've done anything other than my own little videos for music performances since then. But I noticed you mentioned earlier that something like 1,200 people had streamed the film on Vimeo.
As of 2 days.
Rather impressive.
We heard. I'm guessing it's higher now, but yeah. And I'm really happy about it. I mean, I thought, if this event failed, if, for instance, New York has a sudden blackout right now that takes out 3 of us, which would be unfortunate, but is not out of the question, at the very least, people will have seen the movie itself. So this will have been worth doing for that alone.
That's a gloomy.
Okay. It's just my nature. But I guess, Ralph, is there anything else because I know you don't have a lot of time, we have a lot to cover, but is there anything else you wanted to say about the film, or Lou, or Shirley?
Well, yes, there is. When we showed it at Lincoln Center, Lou very much wanted to please Shirley, and she had not seen the film, and the film had been finished maybe 2 or 3 months before, and for some reason she hadn't seen it yet. And I must say, he was really on the edge of his chair. So Shirley agreed to come up to the stage after the screening for the question and answer. And she was in a wheelchair, and she was wearing her red sweater, and her hair was just beautiful. And so she answered a few questions. But what was interesting was, I would have to say that the film took a few months to edit as well. So we would probably finish making the film 6 or 8 months by this time. And so as we're walking backstage at the end of the event with Shirley and Lou, and she looks up at him, she says, you left a lot out. How she remembered that? Because Annie had asked me if there's a lot of additional footage. Well, you'd have to ask Shirley.
The thing I found so charming about this film, and have been recommending it to friends and to my colleagues with, is that Shirley is so clearly the star, and Lou, legendary, path-breaking, world-famous musician, is just her cousin who's in total awe of her and finds her delightful and likes kind of teasing her a little bit, and she's the one who's led the interesting life, and that's what makes it work so well, I think.
She's a great matriarch. It's true. Well, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed having this moment.
I'm so glad we could have you.
Thank you for making the film.
Yeah, brutally. Thank you for making the film. So I guess we'll continue then with, let's go back in time. Really about a century at this point, to the 20s, or even a little earlier. I want to get a sense of what, from Annie, Tony, Laurie, if anyone who wants to jump in, about what we know about Shirley Novick's life besides what was captured on film. And if we could situate that life, especially let's start in the 20s and 30s, in Jewish immigration from Poland after World War I, in the sort of Canadian and border crossing episode she describes. She mentioned she came here illegally across the Canadian border, and in the sort of world of Lower East Side tenements and Brooklyn, I guess, that she arrived in. Annie, maybe you want to start with that.
Sure. I'll just say that I feel like a book could be written about Shirley that could change the way that a lot of people understand American Jewish history, because her life over all of these decades spans, and her family's life, that of her sisters, spans 3 continents, and her political beliefs are so interesting. And there's just a lot that can be mined from her life, but we don't know, I don't personally know that much other than what I kind of tried to research just by looking at census records and things like that. And also Shirley's nephew, Lori had brought a letter that Shirley's nephew, the son of Rosa, her sister, had written, I think after she passed away. And so there's some more history embedded in that as well. But basically, she's born in 1909 in Poland. She grows up in a very labor Zionist family. She goes to a school and learns Hebrew. She's born, though, just 1909, World War I starts in 1914. And she becomes extremely politically active as a young person in Poland. And then the father sends her away when she's 19 because he's worried that she's going to get in trouble for these political activities. She also had married, and that part wasn't in the film, but she was married at the time to a young radical. And so the thought was that it was best for them to get out of Poland at the time. And that was her journey to Canada, to Montreal. And I don't know whether the husband traveled with her or came later or came before her, but she was married. And so she's not entirely alone, although in the journey she might have been. And then works in the garment industry very quickly. And so the fact that she's greeted by family, Lou's grandfather, Mendel Rabinowitz, that's common, right? So many immigrants had been coming for decades, greeted by family members, helped get situated, and then entered the garment industry. So in some ways that is a very typical thing, but I think one of the things that's really important and different, at least from a lot of the experiences of the stories that we tell at the Tenement Museum, is that this is later, and she's coming after 1924. She's coming after the United States had virtually closed the doors to not only Asian immigrants, but Southern and Eastern European immigrants. So she is an undocumented immigrant, and that's not necessarily part of the Jewish history that we learn all the time, but there were thousands of Jews who come after the gates were closed. And there's a great book by Libby Garland about this phenomenon. But then I think, Tony, you should take over with regard to the politics, because I think you can set the political scene for her in a more nuanced way.
Before we go into that, I just wanted to say that, Annie, when we did this event 5 years ago, there was a lot of research. There's not a book on Shirley, which it would be wonderful if there could be, but a lot of her family did some really great research on her past, and it participated in the panel. Jill, Allison, Opal, and also Rafi and Barbara and their family have quite amazing records of Shirley's life, and have collected that. It would be wonderful if it could be put into a book, but it's not like it's a mystery at all. There are many different accounts that Rafi in particular has put together of her life, and Lou was very aware of that in beginning the film, especially talking to Rafi about that.
Also,
and I think it was Jill who wrote the questions, right?
Yes, she did. Yeah.
Before we get into Tony and the political dimensions here, I just want to quickly ask about Canada. There's that very funny moment where she says that she didn't like Montreal, a city I'm very fond of myself, with a rich Jewish history, but she found it provincial, coming from, small town Poland, and she preferred New York. And I thought that was very funny, but I also wondered, do we have any, was that really the only reason she went? Because New York was the big, exciting city? That seems like a lot to risk, illegally crossing a border. And do we have any wider context for why she ultimately went to the US, or why she might have?
She did know some people there, so that probably counted somewhat to get a little bit of help as an immigrant. And
others were doing that too. So there were other people that, even though it wasn't, she would have to be smuggled over, that there would be networks that would she'd be aware of that would, clue her in as to how to do that.
Got it. Okay, so Tony, you were going to talk about the sort of context of her radical politics, I guess, maybe on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, then on the Polish side, Poland had been hit very hard by the war. The economy was bad. Jews were becoming destitute.
This being World War I, just to
Yeah, right. I meant World War I. And there was a 6-year period or so, 7-year period from the start of the war to the end of the Russian Civil War, in which Jews suffered terribly. I mean, Ukraine was a bloodbath for Jews. There were pogroms in Poland, Hungary, elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And it had the effect of radicalizing a lot of young Jews during that period. She was raised, as Annie mentioned, as a Zionist. It radicalized many Zionists who moved further to the left. Many Jews became communists or communist sympathizers, and her sisters went to Palestine and became pioneers, as she said, and she chose North America. New York was a funny time. The 20s was a funny time for Jews in America because, on the one hand, the country had become more conservative. It was a conservative decade. It was a Republican-dominated decade. It was a decade of prosperity. And on the other hand, you had a lot of young Jews like Shirley who were radicalized by the experiences I just described. So, to some degree, Jews, especially in New York and some of the other big cities, were moving to the left as the country was moving to the right. And again, there was this prosperity, but for people like Shirley, she worked in the factories. And I see her as embedded in those tensions and contradictions, the contradictions between young working class immigrants and where the country was at. And then, of course, the Depression hit, and that opened up a new chapter in her life.
So I guess going through the 30s and 40s, as she gets involved in this kind of organizing, I mean, how much do we know about, particular strikes that she might have been involved in, or other political activity? Like what kinds of things would she have been doing? I mean, she describes some of it in the film, but walk us through, I guess, her activities, let's say, through to the post-war period.
Oh, well, in broad strokes, she was active in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That was her union. She said she was a dressmaker. And the film, by the way, was shot in her apartment in an ILGW building. That's where she lived in Chelsea. And, so there was a revival of strike activity and union organizing in the 1930s, and she was very much part of that. And she was part of a communist opposition that she referred to. She referred to it as the left, but what she meant was a communist opposition to the socialist leadership of the ILG. And so she was involved in that kind of organizing. In the 40s, anti-fascism was a big part. The Communist Party supported the American war effort and was very active in supporting the Soviet war effort. The communists became very deeply involved in the Jewish community. They became accepted in the Jewish community with Jewish communal organizations. Communists became very supportive of the Zionist cause and the creation of the State of Israel in the 1940s. And to get the details, and then of course there was the civil rights movement. It was very important in the communist movement to support civil rights and to combat anti-Semitism. For communists, those two issues were always stressed. Anti-Black racism and anti-Jewish racism were constantly fought against and opposed. And so this was her context, left-wing communism, the ILG, the struggle against fascism, and the struggle for Jewish rights.
And strikingly not Zionism, even though Annie mentioned she came out of a labor Zionist family. It was very striking to me that in this short film, and what made it into the short film, she kind of explicitly says she was not a Zionist, and
that was in the 1920s.
Right.
Yeah.
That was in the 20s. By the 1940s, the communist movement, including her future husband, Paul Novick, who edited Die Morgenfreiheit, the communist Yiddish daily, moved to a pro-Zionist position in the 40s.
And Ralphie writes too that she disagreed with Israeli government politics at times, but that she was a supporter of Israel through her life.
Well, she definitely had relatives there.
She visited a number of times, for sure.
Yeah. Well, so Lou Reed was born in what, 1942, I think, is that right? In the middle of the war. And what is the kind of, what, Laurie or anyone, what can you tell us about, like, you know, where he was born, where he came of age, like the world he was kind of born into, and how it relates to what we've gone over so far? What was his connection to this world of, you know, Jewish labor activism and so on? Laurie, there?
I think Laurie's frozen.
Oh, that's no good. Laurie's off. Hopefully Laurie will come back on in a sec, but this is terrible timing.
I mean, in broad strokes, what's going on too is that you have, by the 1940s and certainly the 1950s, you have a movement to suburbs too among many Jews, right? So there's a movement, first there's a movement out of the Lower East Side, then to Brooklyn or to the Bronx, and then there's a movement to suburbs. So I think he's born in Brooklyn, but at a pretty young age, his family moves to the suburbs in Long Island. So that's also part of that world, but that I think Shirley would come and babysit for the family. That is what Lou's sister shared in the program. And I think there's a way that Shirley was this link to the city and I don't know, to that world, you know, whether that was, you know, talked about like I am the political radical, but it's just that was, she's keeping alive this connection that maybe wouldn't have happened had the whole family moved to the suburbs, for example.
I'm a little freaked out about her, although I appreciate what you just said. I just shot her an email to tell her to come back, but does anyone have a way besides email to get in touch with her?
I don't.
Yeah, it's not good. Well, hopefully she'll come back. But in the meantime, I guess we can, right. So Lou grew up on Long Island, and I mean, do either of you have, this is exactly where we wanted Laurie. Do either of you have useful context to share about the relationship he had with her, or we talked earlier, or actually, Tony, you had an interesting thing we were talking about before this started about the different kind of Jewish cultural elements that, can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, sure. I'm saying this with some distance. I have no special great knowledge of Lou Reed's personal life, but it seems to me that he does embody three important strands of Jewish history that converge in him. One is his connection to the Yiddish left through his cousin Shirley, who she was his babysitter, and he was very fond of her. That's one strand, the immigrant labor Yiddish left. Another is his second important influence, which was Delmore Schwartz, his English professor at Syracuse University, who of course was a shining figure in the New York literary avant-garde in the 1930s and 40s. And then finally, his first job out of college, he worked as a songwriter. I think I don't want to name the record company, but I think it was Pickwick Records, but I'm not entirely sure. It was Pickwick. And so, he worked for a Jewish immigrant trying to make it as a songwriter in this very, very Jewish business of independent record labels. So these are disparate strands, but that's what makes it seems to me, his life so remarkable, that these three important strands of Jewish history, popular music, rock and roll, the literary avant-garde, the Yiddish left, touched his life in important ways, in these three important ways, by the time he was in his 1920s. I don't know if he would see his life that way, but as an historian, that's how I see it, that by the time in the 20s, he had, became a kind of legacy of these aspects of Jewish history.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'm sort of interested to chart is is how Manhattan itself had kind of changed by the time that, you know, it's 1967 and the Velvet Underground are launching, and then, you know, later through the rest of Lou's career, you know, the sort of transition that Manhattan made from being this very working class industrial center to being, especially downtown, a kind of hub of avant-garde arts and music, and a place where people might come in from the suburbs or from all over the country, all over the world to like, you know, experiment in different ways. And against a sort of like fading industrial backdrop, which I feel is kind of present in I mean, literally, you know, with Andy Warhol having the factory. But I wonder if, did either of you have like a good sense of the kind of emergence of the post-war avant-garde? I know that's not precisely what you specialize in, but it's the same physical space and some of the same families a generation later that we're talking about here.
I mean, on the one hand, the Lower East Side, where I think he would be for a while too, it becomes the most diverse neighborhood, or one of the most diverse neighborhoods in New York. So even though immigration has been cut off, or was cut off in the 20s from Eastern and Southern Europe, you have also a Puerto Rican migration. You also have the Great Migration from the South. So the Lower East Side still remains a very working class neighborhood where people are working in the garment industry, but it's a different mix. And then you have late 60s and 70s more artists as well moving into the neighborhood. So the artists would be, you know, in some cases, people who had come from the suburbs, whether the suburbs of New York or elsewhere.
And so in a sense, you know, for someone like Lou Reed moving to the Lower East Side as he did in the mid 1960s, it was a kind of return in a sense. There were still a lot of Jews who lived in the Lower East Side and never left at that period. And he, you know, went back to where the Jewish story started for so many on the Lower East Side, and which was becoming, as Annie said, and you said, David, a hub of the avant-garde artists. Of course, there are different communities of avant-garde artists and musicians, and that would eventually really come to the fore with punk rock. And Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground were extremely influential in the emergence of punk rock. I mean, they were viewed as along with the Stooges, as maybe the two most influential groups in the rise of punk. And so he carried forward a story, you know, a lineage in his own way.
Yeah,
it's amazing to think. Oh, sorry. I was just thinking about how Union Square, which could have been where she went on I think she mentions this in the film, a strike or a march for Social Security, one of the first marches for Social Security in 1930. That's also where the same place where Warhol would have his studio too, so that thinking about these different moments and how their lives converged in these city spaces.
Just so people know, we have some sign of life from Lori. She said she emailed that she's trying to get back on. So
I found it.
Yay.
Oh, I'm sorry. The internet just crashed. And that never happens. I don't know what have I missed?
Well, we talked about some of that transition, you know, the industrialization, suburbanization, the rise of punk and counterculture, and you, Laurie, were telling us, well, you met Lou in the early 90s, right?
Yeah, 91, and then 92 we became partners.
But you had been in New York and working the arts since the late 60s?
Well, yes, and the arts means many circles, all of which consider themselves the center of the world. So you had like the fashion world, we called each one of them worlds: fashion world, avant-garde world, pop world, rock world, punk world, experimental theater world, downtown theater world. It was 1,000 little circles, and unbelievably, you wouldn't necessarily meet everybody. You would kind of travel in your own little circle, and they orbited around each other. Um, but they didn't often really intersect, strangely.
So how did you meet Lou? What brought that
We
about?
met in Munich.
Met in Munich.
We met in Munich. We were invited to do a concert commemorating Kristallnacht, and it was organized by John Zorn, who basically introduced us, and so we met in that context. And I remember coming to Munich and being in line behind some of the other people who were going to play in the show, and they all had T-shirts on, front and back, that said "Rhythm and Jews" on it, and I was like, "Wow, this is really cool." It's like, we'll see what happens, and the guards were like, "Okay, where are you going?" And we're like, "Well, we're going to a concert," and they to do a concert commemorating Kristallnacht, and they were like, "Why would you want to do that?" And so I was pulled aside and asked that, and but Zorn is a very fierce guy, and his record label is all about well, a lot of it is about Jewish all sorts of history and culture and conflict, and so anyway, Lou was doing a work called Andy's Dream, and he said, would you be in my show? And this is very stupid, and I'm not very proud of this, but I at the time thought Lou was British. I thought he was a British musician. I'm not. It just seems weird to me now, but that's what I thought.
His music, right?
I knew some of his music, but recently we, in the estate of which I'm working on for years, we do many releases of his work, and especially early work now that we found a lot of really amazing pieces of music from just when he was starting. And so it's like you hear the very, very earliest versions of songs. And so it was, anyway, one of them was Andy's Dream. And he asked me to do the vocal in that concert, in the Kristallnacht concert. And then at the end, he said, it was perfect. It was just the way I would do it. So that was how we met. And then with our first date was the American Acoustical Engineering Society to go and look at microphones. So we kind of met with kind of tech and history as a background. But I wanted to also say, in looking at Red Shirley again today, how much I loved the banter between the two of them. They really loved each other. They loved each other. I went over to many dinners with Shirley, who was cooking. She was a really good cook, and a really wonderful, lively person. But and Lou was helping her in so many things. She had macular degeneration, and he found out. He did so much research on that, and he was constantly giving her all sorts of things to improve her vision and help her. But she was the banter was the thing that I loved the most, because she would just go, Louis, kill me now. I'm 100, and he's like, Shirley, I can't kill you now. What do you want me to smother you with a pillow? I mean, I was like, whoa, that was like an ongoing comedy act. It really was. She was hilarious, and the love that the two of those had, but the banter was really amazing. I also, in thinking of that, realized that I went to Israel with Lou for the first time. He was never there before. And I had been many times to Israel, and I was just thinking of his reaction to being there, which was really well. That's a whole nother story, but it was and he took some incredible pictures there, and I think that he found some really amazing connections there, and there had been I had worked with a rabbi there on some projects, and I got to introduce them, and they really connected. And he was the one who did the service for Lou when he died. And so I think that was probably Lou's only rabbi. He was really just a friend of ours.
Yeah, so actually, that leads well into another thing I wanted to ask about, which is, and totally understanding if some aspects of this are too sensitive or whatever, but if you can talk a little about what either his Jewish background or just more broadly this kind of immigrant family history, this labor history, this activism, what did that mean to Lou? What did Shirley? I mean, it's very clear they had a bond, but what did her story mean to him?
I think she was enormously inspiring to him, but it was also when I think of that, I also think of one of Lou's closest friends, Hal Wilner, who also had a very, very deep connection to Jewish culture and particularly to the Holocaust. And so that the two of them had a real bond that was really between the two of them. It was not something that Lou was really talking about, although it was in every single piece of music that he ever wrote, I think. The sense of empathy that he had for and understanding of and need to kind of create an empathetic relationship with people, as a writer, as a musician, and as a person. If you can make those into those categories, it's pretty silly. But activism also was. I did really a number of things with Lou, and I know how much that meant to him, to help people, literally just to help them. And he would never put it that way. He was I think that would have embarrassed him a lot, but he was he helped so many people, first of all, and then we were involved in many different things. Probably the last thing was the Occupy group in New York, and that was one of the things that I'll really never forget, because it was in a way how activism and art connected for me in a way that they hadn't before. But he was came to all the Occupy meetings, and everybody in the Occupy movement was really impressed because he would really dress up for the meetings. Everyone else was like just t-shirts, and he came in his full glory of like leather outfits and stuff, and super styling. And anyway, this event that I want to mention was at Lincoln Center, and it was the performance of Satyagraha by Philip Glass, the opera about the life of Gandhi. And so we decided to do an action in the plaza in front of Lincoln Center. And so we had a huge group of Occupy people, but the police had somehow found out about it, so Lincoln Center was surrounded by thousands of police. So these opera goers come out as a very crispy December night, and they're very elegant people coming out of the opera. They've just seen an opera on Gandhi, on Satyagraha means truth force. So they've seen what it is to seek seek that and so suddenly wait. They walk out and see what that looks like in their own city that night. And it was, Lou was very much part of the reading that happened then, as was Phil. So Phil Glass came out and he read some words from the opera. The opera's in Sanskrit, so fortunately he read them in English. And they were broadcast the way Occupy used a sound system, which is the speaker speaks and then the inner circle repeats and the outer circle repeats, and it reverberates out in circles. So Phil was reading these words. So they were, when your government breaks, when your government breaks, when your government breaks, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Do you just stand there? Do you just stand there? Do you just stand there? And anyway, and then Lou jumped in the middle and said, I'm from Brooklyn, and I just want to say that I like police when they, and you should come in, you should break the line, and so should all the opera goers. So just come on in, we're all doing this together. And it was a transformative moment for me, just to see somebody break those barriers with, and it did work. So people sort of like, what is this thing? I don't know what it was. So he was able to articulate things like that and move people in ways that I think they didn't expect. So
that's a really wonderful story. I just want to encourage the audience to write in questions. We have, in a few minutes, we can do a Q&A. So if you have questions for Annie or Tony or Laurie, please just write them in the Q&A box. Annie, you want to say something?
I was just going to ask Laurie, one of the things in the film, she talks about how she became a speaker and like what it was for her to be a speaker. And clearly she moved so many people. So that was just nice to kind of see that link to the story that you told. But you, at the panel we had, you spoke about how Shirley was so inspiring to you because she was a badass woman. I was wondering if you could speak to that, like what, your sense of her and why her life as a woman and how she acted is still relevant today.
Well, first of all, I mean, I do love that she's badass, but she also is somebody who is a real citizen of the world, and that was really inspiring to me. At the very beginning of this film, she says, "I'm dedicating this to the people of my town." And you're like, oh, well, what an incredible thing to say, to remember that and to speak to them who are not there. and so I guess that the combination of wisecracking and heart-rending ability to feel the world was what I think was inspiring to me, and really just that she was very funny, and that was a really yeah.
I see that we've lost Tony, which is really unfortunate.
Oh my God. I don't know what's happening with this. Is it the thunderstorms? Yes.
Well, he's in Wisconsin, so I actually have no idea what he said, that it was relatively temperate there. But I'm looking. Okay. Can you say more about Shirley's relationship to Yiddish culture? And did Lou know Yiddish at all? Asks someone in the audience. I would also like to know the answer to that.
Oh, he knew the catchwords, you know. He knew a lot of the catchwords, and used them, but he didn't know Yiddish, no.
For her, it was clearly, if you could even see in the film all the books that were there. There were so many Yiddish books, and she was also married to Pesach Novik, or Paul Novik, who was the editor of the Morgenfreiheit, a Yiddish newspaper, Yiddish communist newspaper. So Yiddish was her world. I think that's a really important way of understanding her, even as she's learning English. The people that she's talking about politics with, or many of them, are going to be Yiddish speakers, and people coming over for dinner. And of course, as the generations go by, her own family doesn't speak Yiddish, right? The next generations don't. But I think for her, that was still very, very much a big part of her life. Tony, the question had been about Shirley's relationship to Yiddish and Yiddish culture, which I think.
And actually, there have also been several people asking about Paul Novik and the Morgenfreiheit, so I think which doesn't get addressed in the movie. But if you don't know what that is, but if Tony, maybe you want to speak about that a little, about him and about what the Morgenfreiheit represented.
I'll just say that I freeze the frame when I was watching the movie. There was a shot of her bookshelf, and I froze it because I saw Yiddish books. I wanted to see what she was reading. And she had 2 volumes of Sholem Aleichem in Yiddish, and then others I couldn't make out the titles. The Freiheit's a story in and of itself, but it was the daily of the communist Yiddish movement. Pesach Paul Novik became editor, I think, in 1939, and was the editor until the end of the paper, which I think was 1989. And the paper kind of had a split personality in a lot of ways, because it was a very good literary paper from the very beginning, one of the best literary papers. And on the other hand, of course, it was a communist paper, which meant that it was often very rigid, very dogmatic, and radically switched positions on any number of issues, depending on Soviet foreign policy. And it constantly cost the paper writers and readers when it shifted this way or that way. So, as I say, the paper we had this kind of split personality. Eventually it became, already in the 1940s, I think it started to become a more flexible paper. And then after 1956, after the death of Stalin and then the Khrushchev revelations in 1956, it became a much more independent newspaper. But of course, by then, the readership was starting to fade. I'll tell you what I think is a kind of a funny little anecdote. I have a speech that I had dinner a couple of times with Shirley in the 1990s, and she made cabbage soup for me and schnitzel. And she also had some interesting documents that belonged to Pesach Novik that she let me photocopy. But then she asked for my help in going through her papers. And I had no idea there was any connection to Lou Reed, but there was a copy of Rolling Stone magazine. And I said, Shirley, I noticed you have a copy of Rolling Stone magazine here. Are you a reader? Why do you have this? And she said, because my cousin's on the cover. I said, who's your cousin? And she said, Lou Reed. Of course, that's my cousin. And so she wanted me to help her go through many of her papers. And I was going through her papers, and there was a transcript of a speech he gave at the CMJ Music Convention. It must have been around 1990. And it was entirely on anti-Semitism. And this goes to something Laurie was saying about how important, what an issue of concern that was to him. But in that, and this brings it back to the Freiheit, he refers in the speech to his cousin Shirley, who for years was a reader of the Vorwärts, he said. He got confused between the Vorwärts and the Freiheit. And it was so funny because, of course, those newspapers were bitter enemies. Just a little
We don't have time to talk about how Jewish currents fits into that whole history, but it has its own weird layer.
It's an outgrowth. The short answer is it's an outgrowth of the Morning Freiheit.
Right. So we'll leave it at that for now. We don't want to get too far afield. We do have some questions. People who want to know a little bit more about Lou's Jewish background. I don't know if like how comfortable a topic that is, but if there's anything that Laurie you can say about how he felt about Judaism specifically or Jewish identity specifically, I think there is some interest in that.
Well, I think it wasn't like he took a stance, you know. There were many things that kind of came and went but I think that I can tell you he was very horrified by things that were happening in Israel, and he was very much very adamant about that, and that he was. We spent some time with Palestinians as well, and he was very clear about wanting to do that, and so he did. And I think I mean, it's so complicated, you know, with to say what your identity is. I think his identity was as a writer, and he could see so many sides of every question, and that he was always considering and not kind of planting himself over here or over there, except in terms of empathy, in which he would always have empathy for also for those who were losing, you know, losers. He had great empathy for them. So when in conflicts, he would really kind of automatically go for that. So whatever that means in terms of his Jewish identity, I wouldn't speculate.
Well, that actually might be a good note to end on, although we have another minute or two if there's anything else any of you wanted to you know, discuss before we do. But
I would just say to Laurie, what Laurie had mentioned earlier about all the papers and the letters that the family has, just for the sake of history and archives, I hope that one day all those letters and her stories make it into archives that people can access, because I think the story is very complicated and very fascinating, and I just want as many people to know about it as possible.
Yeah, maybe there's a writer out there who wants to take that on. I mean, when you realize your connections to history like this, like for me, from Lou going back to through Red Shirley to these other moments in history, it's so important to make those ties and write it down, you know. So I hope that somebody wants to take that on. I would be 100% happy about that, to have her story in a book.
Yes, and that the next time a program about her is advertised, it's a picture of her.
Yeah, she's her with her own book.
Yes.
Well, if anyone in the audience is interested in taking up any of these projects, it sounds like
there's a lot of material there. Whoa.
Is there a good way to get in touch with you, Laurie? That
oh yeah, there's a I can post it on your let's see, what should I do? I have to think of the best way to do that, because it would route through someone, but maybe if you have a follow-up for that, we can make a little.
Yeah, I guess here's what I'll say. If anyone is interested in researching this or in getting in touch with Laurie, email me, David K, note the K, at jewishcurrents.org, or email Jewish Currents however you would otherwise. And if it seems to me like you have a project that would be productive in this regard, then I'll inform Laurie of it. And
Oh, that's very nice of you. But I do hope you think about this, writers out there. It's great to write great stories.
I think this is history we need to save. And
Yeah, it is.
and you know, if by any chance any of you who are watching this have not actually watched the film yet, you can do so on Vimeo, and I think it's well worth 28 minutes of your time. So thank you all so much. This was really wonderful. I'm glad we overcame the various blackout scares.
Thanks for doing this, David. It's just great that you put this together. Thank you.
Really, it's an honor, and I'm very appreciative of all of your time.
And nice to meet you, Tony. And see you
Likewise.
soon.
Likewise.
Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.